Before we began, the audience voted whether they were for the motion, a network neutrality law is necessary, against the motion that a network neutrality law is necessary, or that they were undecided. At the conclusion of tonight's debate, we'll ask the audience to vote again. The side that has moved the most votes in the course of the debate, or in other words, changed the most minds, will be declared the winner. But first, round one. And in round one, you will hear opening arguments from each one of our debaters. And the first debater is Professor Timothy Wu, who is a professor at Columbia Law School. He's the chairman of the media reform organization, The Free Press, and co-author of Who Controls the Internet. He's been recognized by Scientific American as one of the top 50 leaders in science and technology, and by Harvard 02138 magazine as one of the university's 100 most influential graduates. He is best known for coining the term we debate here tonight, net neutrality, arguing for the motion, a network neutrality law is necessary, Professor Tim Wu.
Go ahead. Well, hello, everybody. It's obviously a pleasure to be in this, see all of you here, come out to hear about net neutrality, sort of an arcane topic. And it's obviously a pleasure to be in this building. I think probably half of you came for that reason. But let me do two things. I want to describe, first of all, what we mean by a net neutrality law. And I think that'll make it more obvious why we think it's necessary. Then I want to give you three reasons, three important reasons that it is necessary to have a law like this. First of all, what we need by a net neutrality law is fundamentally a law that says internet carriers should not block the internet. They should not block any content, any applications, or anything anyone wants to attach to the internet. People should be free, that is, in other words, to go to the applications of their choice, access the content of their choice, and attach what they want, provided it's lawful, and doesn't harm the network, to the internet. That may seem like a very basic and I believe very fundamental principle, but let me explain why it is, in fact, also a very necessary principle. The most important reason is to protect the innovation and entrepreneurship environment that the internet has come to represent. The symbol or the trademark of internet entrepreneurship is the right to innovate without permission. It is the right to start a company, not the right to succeed, but the right to start, the right to try to reach customers without having to gain the permission of the telephone and cable companies. This has been the single most important part of the internet since its founding from a business perspective. It is a model of how capitalism is supposed to work, where the price of market entry is low as possible, where a person in a garage, an amateur, foreigners, anyone can give it a shot, can try and reach people. That principle is so important to the economic growth that we all depend upon, and as I'll say in a moment, the cultural flourishing that the internet has supported. In an environment without an internet net neutrality law, carriers are free to block applications they don't agree with for one reason or another. Maybe they're a threat to their business model. Maybe they just don't see a way to make money off of it. Or maybe they just don't think it's a good idea. Freedom to innovate is the backbone of the internet economy and the most important reason to have a net neutrality rule.
Professor Wu, your time is up. Your time is up.
Okay.
Arguing on the counter side against the motion, a network neutrality law is necessary, James Assey is the former Senior Democratic Counsel to the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. He is the current Executive Vice President for the National Cable and Telecommunications Association. James Assey.
Thank you, Josh. You haven't heard me yet. Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here, particularly with such a very impressive panel. I feel like the guy who brought the knife to the gunfight, but I'm happy to be here to talk about net neutrality and what I see as not only an unnecessary law, but an unwise one as well. I think it was important to note, actually, that Chris started out by trying to define the problem, because one of the most difficult parts about this entire debate has been the inability to come up with a precise definition. Depending upon who you talk to, this is about the ability of network operators to block someone's speech, about the ability of network operators to want to offer quality of service for a price, about the ability of network operators to potentially charge individuals who use more of an internet resource more than somebody who uses less of it. So depending upon who you talk to, it's very difficult to know what it is this law is supposed to do. And I think more fundamentally, those who would proffer that we need a law to institute a principle of openness suffer, I think, from the misguided belief that the dynamism and the innovation that we have all experienced as part of the internet and the significant amounts of private capital that we need to build the internet is somehow going to be helped by a government law rather than by the very real business imperative for all of us to grow what is an internet ecosystem. And it's worth reflecting on that, because when we talk about network neutrality, too often we get wound up in this debate about edge versus core and whether innovation is better in one side versus another, when in reality the internet is an ecosystem, one which involves symbiotic relationships. If you look back 10 years ago, we only had 1% of our nation with broadband connections. 30% of us were still listening to that annoying, buzz of connecting to dial-up. And for most of the applications that you and I use today, the internet simply did not work at dial-up speed. It required massive amounts of investment by companies like Bob's and cable providers who have built pipes that now allow us to go anywhere we want, to do anything we want. And as network operators, we respect and, in fact, want to encourage the ability of consumers to use the internet in that way. But, of course, the story of investment and progress didn't just happen. It was essentially founded upon principles of regulatory restraint and humility, which started back in the late 1990s with Bill Kennard, who coined the term vigilant restraint as cable modem service was just being able to be rolled out and cable operators were investing in new technology. And it was followed up in 2004 and 2005 with the 4 freedoms that were articulated by Chairman Powell: the freedom to attach, the freedom to do whatever it is you want on the internet. And those are freedoms that we try and our businesses try to support on every day. And fundamentally, despite all the Sturm und Drang around this idea and the fact that people will make mistakes from time to time, these policies have worked to fuel growth and growth in the reach and the capability of the internet.
James Assey, your time is up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Debating next for the motion, a network neutrality law is necessary. Brad Burnham is the partner in renowned venture capital fund at Union Square Ventures. In the early 90s, he spun out software company Ecologic from Bell Laboratories as AT&T's first venture as part of their venture arm. Today, he sits on the board of 9 startups and is part of the lifeblood that makes the New York technology community run. Venture capitalist Brad Burnham.
Thank you, Jason. Back in first grade, we used to have these things where you had to answer this quiz. One of these things is not like the other, and I feel a little bit like this up here. I'm surrounded by economists and policy people who actually know what they're talking about, and I don't. And so I'm going to just share with you my personal experience of working with companies that depend on the internet. about 10 years ago, I started in the venture capital business, actually a little bit more than that, and I was doing infrastructure investing for AT&T Ventures, and I did a lot of switches and routers and things like that. And it was a great run. It was a great opportunity to invest at that time. When I moved over to Union Square Ventures, we pretty much walked away from that entirely and began investing entirely in the applications layer of the web. And there was a reason for that. And the reason for that was that the investment opportunity had really shifted from the switches and routers that built the core of the internet to the applications that rode on top. But they depended on something that not too many people, I think, really understood at the time. And Tim has referred to it as the ability to create a business without permission. There were two characteristics of the web that made that possible. The first is that it has end-to-end connectivity, so any person could get to any other person or any other application, and that was a key characteristic. The second is that the architecture was layered, which separated the physical connectivity from the logical connectivity and from the application that rode on top of it. A lot of us forget right now that that was a complete accident. The internet wasn't really conceived to be the thing that we all know today. It was designed, I think, originally by the Rand Corporation to meet a specific task, which was to survive a massive nuclear attack. And so they had to create a network where every single element of the network was able to pass along a message to the next one. In case 90% of the elements were out, if there was one path, it would get through. Well, the impact of that was that it created this enormous explosion of innovation and investment because it allowed people to invest without worrying about whether or not the companies that they were going to invest in were going to have direct access to the users. So things like Google and eBay and YouTube and Facebook and Twitter only exist because we understood with the web that these companies would be able to get directly to users. Contrast this for a second with the wireless industry. If you remember, I mean, obviously there's a huge investment in the wireless industry to buy spectrum, to put the infrastructure in place. But if you look at the investment at the applications layer in the wireless industry, until recently, it's been very paltry and not particularly successful. If you talk to a guy like Fabrice Grinda, who is one of the founders of a company called Zingy that was very early on in the ringtone space, he said this was
15 seconds.
He said this was a great business until the carriers asked for 40% of my business and the IP providers, the music companies, asked for 50%. All of a sudden, it wasn't just a matter of whether or not he could get to the market, but once he was in the market, he had no control over his destiny. So the problem for me as an investor is that there's no way for me to invest in an applications layer business that depends on the distribution or the good graces of the underlying carrier. I guess I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. We are now halfway through round one. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the sponsors that made tonight possible, amongst those Verizon, Google, IAC, and the Web 2.0 Expo. Thank you very much for your support. Arguing next against the motion, Robert Quinn is the Senior Vice President, Federal Regulatory for AT&T, where he is responsible for matters pending before the FCC. This audience may know him better as the author of AT&T's response to the FCC's inquiry into the rejection of the Google Voice application from the iPhone App Store. Arguing against the motion, a network neutrality law is necessary, Robert Quinn.
Thank you, Jason. I'd like to start by saying that I agree with just about everything that Professor Wu stated at the outset here. But I disagree with him that we need a new law to put those principles into motion. The current structure that we have at the FCC has 4 principles in place. Internet freedoms, I think, is how they were originally coined by then FCC Chairman Michael Powell, that say that you should be able to download any application, you should be able to connect any lawful device to the network, download any lawful content, and have fair competition amongst the different members of the internet ecosystem. And we don't need a new law to put those practices into place. The structure that we have in place today currently achieves the balance that Professor Wu was articulating is an important part of keeping the internet open and maintaining the openness of the internet structure. I would also point out that we have to achieve another kind of balance. And the other kind of balance that we have to achieve is we have to realize that the cost of building and maintaining the internet, the infrastructure costs, are enormous. And just like investments in edge applications, in order to be able to get the investment dollars to build that infrastructure, you have to be able to achieve a return on those investments. You have to be able to make the money back. The FCC has estimated that the cost of building out broadband, a single broadband connection to every single American to achieve a bandwidth speed of 100 megabits per second, which is always the nirvana that folks talk about, is going to cost about $350 billion. We think that estimate is actually low. Ultimately, you're going to have a balance that goes into place. And that balance is going to say, how are we going to recover those dollars at the end of the day? If all of those dollars have to be recovered from the end users, the result of that is going to be that the cost of internet access is going to go up. And in today's environment, where we have internet services and adoptions that hover in the 55 to 60% range in terms of adoption itself for internet, given today's rates, it's hard to imagine that the marketplace is going to support an additional expense in the range that we're talking about in order to be able to achieve that. Now, on the flip side of it, obviously, creating commercial services on the infrastructure side that helps support that is what we believe is the path towards achieving a balance that's going to be able to keep the internet open with the 4 principles that we have in place, keep the cost of the internet to the consumer low so that we can work on the adoption issue that we have in this country, and achieve a balance with edge application providers. We're not talking about tariffing services and requiring people to spend money, but we are saying that at the infrastructure level, we should allow business models in place that are going to help commercialize, if you will, different types of services that will help pay for the expense, the enormous expense that the FCC has estimated is going to cost to build out the infrastructure that we have in this country.
Robert Quinn, your time is up.
Okay.
Thank you. Arguing on the other side for the motion, a network neutrality law is necessary. Professor Nicholas Economides teaches at the Stern School of Business at NYU. He is executive director at the Net Institute and has written extensively on network industries, including the internet, telecommunications, as well as antitrust application in public policy. His website, Economics of Networks, has been ranked as one of the top economic sites worldwide by Economist magazine. Arguing for the motion, a network neutrality law is necessary, Professor Nicholas Economides.
Thank you very much. So we don't forget, I urge you to vote yes later. So I urge you to vote that the FCC needs to formalize the net neutrality tradition of the Internet. The Internet, as you know, is the most successful network in human history ever. It's a new network. Its commercial life is only 16 years. It's based on interactive communication, revolutionary real-time participation, never existed before. It's widely successful, almost 1 billion hosts globally. Has created massive innovation at the edge of the networks. Growth, cultural flourishing that Tim mentioned, all kinds of things. Without the internet, companies like Facebook, Amazon, Twitter, eBay, Google would not exist. And the internet success was based on openness and non-discrimination. And the words net neutrality mean non-discrimination. Content from anyone of any type is treated equally. Old networks that didn't have this principle, if you might remember, if you're as old as I, CompuServe, Prodigy, early AOL, either died or they were folded in the internet. So given all this success, why do the telephone companies and cable companies want to kill net neutrality and introduce discrimination when the network has been so successful this far? I think it's because their interests do not coincide with the interests of the public. Why? Why do they want to do that? Why do they want to kill net neutrality? Reason one is to promote their own services, which are threatened by new ones brought through the internet, provided through the internet. Voice over IP and Skype threaten traditional phone services. Video downloads, more common these days, threaten cable TV video. Reason number two, to make more money. When I hear my friends here talk about investing in infrastructure, keep in mind, where am I going to find the money to invest in infrastructure? I will need to make more money. So how do I make more money? Instead of just getting on this side of the network, I'll get some from the other side as well. Keep in mind, the internet is also not the main money maker for telephone companies and cable companies. Telephone companies make money from voice, cable companies make money from video. The internet is an afterthought for both of these companies. So they're thinking of how do we make more money from this, which potentially can threaten our traditional services. Can these companies kill the internet? The answer is unfortunately yes. If net neutrality is not formalized, once they upgrade the routers, install the right software, they can kill net neutrality. Can they do it profitably? Unfortunately, also yes, because there is a lot of market power in the last mile of the network, only a cable company and a telephone company. Therefore, the traditional competitive conditions, where if one company starts discriminating, competition doesn't allow it to make money, this will not happen because there is so much concentration on the last mile of the internet. So they can implement discrimination profitably, and the way to preserve net neutrality is to pass a law that says it's there, it's necessary, we need it, it's in the public interest.
Professor, your time is up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So you've just heard the opening arguments, and that concludes the end of round one.
One more.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Nice try.
It's our cleanup.
Before we move on to round two,
Got to pitch to A-Rod, man.
and I apologize to Professor Yu. He is a professor of law and communication at the University of Pennsylvania. He has written extensively on regulation of internet, the economics of copyright, and imperfect competition. In addition, he is the director for the Center of Technology, Innovation, and Competition, arguing against the motion a network neutrality law is necessary. Their final debater, Professor Christopher Yu.
Nick has told us a story about why companies might want to give discrimination, prioritize certain sources, certain applications above others. And I was thinking about this particular audience focusing on Web 2.0, and I realized you guys understand, or in the best position to understand, that in fact there's another explanation. We started off with Web 2.0 basically being bloggers, Wikipedia, text-driven, browser-driven, low bandwidth, latency-tolerant, jitter-tolerant applications that were very robust in the way that they first deployed. What we see is the new generation of Web 2.0 applications, video-based, often very intolerant of jitter, bandwidth-intensive, much more demanding of the services that are required of the network. And in fact, they're asking more and more. I looked at the panels. There was a panel, there's going to be sessions during this conference about latency trumps all. And in fact, we're going to new architectures like cloud computing. And in fact, getting guaranteed levels of service in cloud computing Web 2.0 applications becomes more essential than ever. And we're talking about new topological solutions. We're talking about new technologies. It's not just a telephone-based system the way it grew in the 90s. We have things like cable, which are acutely sensitive to local congestion because they share bandwidth at the neighborhood level with 500 end users. We have wireless solutions where extremely bandwidth constrained because of Shannon's law are extremely subject to congestions in a way that no wireline technology was ever by its nature done, that are less reliable, and therefore the inferences we make about managing congestion no longer work, that a drop packet we assumed meant it was congested and we should react accordingly. In fact, sometimes in a wireless network, a dropped packet is a dropped packet. And that's much more common. And what we're starting to see is the end of what I think of as one-size-fits-all solutions. We have a growing variety of applications, a growing variety of end users, a growing variety of technologies, all of which are requiring increasing our capabilities of what we can do with the network, but at the same time are not going to necessarily require the same solution everywhere we go. So what's an example? The end-to-end guarantee in the network, which is what many high latency sensitive applications need to survive, Web 2.0 applications, any kind of applications, has long been a goal for the networking community. Type of service was part of the original IP header. We've talked about IntServe, DiffServe, MPLS. We've been trying to make that work to make certain kind of applications possible that need something different from the network that the network could never provide before. And what we're starting to see is a lot of experimentation with new solutions about how to prioritize certain traffic over others. The way cell phones do, they'll give you your voice and hold your email if you're in a dead spot. Why? You can't stand a skip in the voice, and if you have to wait for a few seconds to get your email, that's okay. And so what we're starting to see is a great experimentation with solutions, particularly in the wireless space. In many ways, the question could be asked this way. There are good solutions for prioritization. There are bad, potentially, solutions, as Nick talks about. Can we trust the government to be the one to tell the difference between the two? Because in a way, by putting this into a regulatory environment where we're going to have hearings in DC about whether this is one of those situations where we're prioritizing to increase the functionality of the network, or this is one of those instances that Nick is worried about, throws into the hands of decision makers in DC to tell us what our network can do and can't do. And that is a hedge that I think that a lot of people are reluctant to do. And what we may see is that as what people want from the network becomes more diverse, we should expect the network to become more diverse to meet those needs. And we should expect that this may be nothing more than the natural evolution of new technologies, a broader range of technologies, and a broader range of applications and demands being placed on the network, and the network evolving in response. And what we should see is maybe parts of the network will experiment in ways that other parts won't. And in fact, will that be discriminatory? Yes, certain things will run differently in different parts of the network. But as we get a network that's confronting diverse users, diverse applications, diverse topologies, and diverse technologies comprising it, that should come as no surprise.
Professor, your time is up. Thank you. And that concludes the end of round one. In round two, the debaters will be able to speak directly to each other and respond to each other. But before we begin that, I will start that off with a question. It sounds like the side for the motion is arguing on behalf of the companies that create on top of the internet. As many of you have put it, they create on the edge of the network. And you were saying that if we fail to pass a net neutrality law, the innovation of those companies will be stifled. And on the other side, I hear you all debating that you are for the side of the people who've created the infrastructure of the internet, the AT&Ts, the Verizons that have created the infrastructure that makes the core network capability work. And you're saying that if we do pass a net neutrality law, that we risk stifling the innovation of those companies. So my question is it possible that you are both right and that we have found each other in a catch-22? And I will send that over to...
What's the catch-22? Sorry. Maybe I didn't understand.
Okay. It's very pessimistic.
It is a pessimistic assessment because if you think about any conventional business, whether it's an shoe manufacturing, you have people who make shoes, you have the retailers who sell shoes. And in one sense, they're cooperating. You don't make money unless you sell product. And then after you sell the product and you make money, you're going to get in a hell of a fight over who gets to claim what. And what's happening here is, in many ways, we're setting this up as it's only retail versus production, or production versus retail. That is, in many ways, a false dichotomy. There is a cooperative venture here between the people who are making content and people who are doing it. Now, there is a fight. But the point is, we cannot let the adversarial part of this overwhelm the cooperative part, or else no one involved in this business, whether they're content or network, is going to get anywhere. And so we have to find, I think the Verizon Google statement, common statement of areas of agreement was incredibly promising. I think Comcast's work with the P4P, with the BitTorrent, has been incredibly promising, and I do think there's a lot of potential for actually realizing there's ways to create value.
can I say something on the other side? I actually believe that we should keep in mind that the evolution of the internet this far, wildly successful, was done under net neutrality. And you should see the question that is being asked as, do we want to preserve the present regime, or do we want to empower some people, like AT&T, cable companies, that happen these days to control the edge of the network towards the consumers? Should we allow these guys to start squeezing everybody else, to start determining who is going to be the winner in search, who is going to be the winner in content, and so on? The industry, the residential industry of providing broadband in the United States, all of them combined, telecom and cable companies, has profits of less than $20 billion, something between 15 and 20. They know better than me, but it's something of that order. The surplus, the profits that get created on the other side of the network, and the satisfaction by the consumers from the internet is, in my estimate, at least $500 billion. So it's completely absurd to let the guys who have a share of 20 determine what happens to the $500 billion. That's maybe too much an economist argument. I hope it's clear.
I would like to respond to that, Nick, because I just don't see this as an either-or debate anymore. I think that this issue has evolved over time, and that we have an infrastructure in place at the FCC today to basically serve as the arbiter of any debate where you think that a network infrastructure company is doing something that's anti-consumer or anti-competitive. And I think that regime exists today because we all need openness. We are, as James said, we're part of a big ecosystem. And as Christopher pointed out, it's got to be a cooperative ecosystem where we all have to figure out the ways to get along. I throw out the $350 billion number, and I'm just telling you, consumers are going to pay for that. Right? If we're going to invest in the infrastructure, somebody's going to end up paying for it. And if we can create, if we can, in order to handle some of the ideas that Christopher was talking about, that not all packets are created equally. Some packets have greater demands on the network with their time-sensitive applications. And if we can create services that can help defray the expense of building out the internet, then why isn't that a good thing in order to be able to keep the rates as low as we possibly can and maybe get to achieve an adoption rate in this country that's higher than the 55% that we're seeing today? And I will tell you, you can't freeze this technology where it was 20 years ago, because the types of applications that exist that we see on our network today are not the same as they were 10 years ago or 5 years ago. And we have to evolve with the technology, and we have to, in order to do that, we're going to have to dump a boatload of money into the network. And all we're saying is, let's not kill any potential revenue sources that will help defray that, but let's work cooperatively within the structure that we have in place currently.
Brad Burnham, you'd like to respond?
So let's first go back, and I think that part of the argument that I heard there is it's not broken. It seems to be working. Let's not fix it. And obviously, the great applications that we see on the web at the edge today would be evidence of that. But we have to remember that what actually happened here is the internet was created in the narrowband era and not in the broadband era. And in the narrowband era, the telephone company, the last mile, was completely unaware of what was actually happening on their lines. We all used dial-up modems. We all went to independent ISPs. Remember UUNet and Pipeline and those companies? Well, what happened is, demand increased for greater bandwidth. So we moved from the narrowband to the broadband area. And when we did that, we moved right smack dab into the middle of the core competence, frankly, of the cable companies and the telcos, and into their last mile duopoly. And so, as a result, those independent ISPs are all gone, and we now have only one way to get to the web. And so now, for the first time, this is a very important set of problems. The second question on network cost that Bob brought up is, yeah, it's real. I don't know that it's as real as he says it is, but somebody's going to have to pay for it. But we can separate the question of what it costs to build out the network from what it costs to create the applications. And by doing that, we don't risk the problem of having what is essentially a common carrier, somebody who controls that last mile, influencing, as Nick said, what we get to see and what applications get to be built. And it makes it possible for me to continue to invest in the applications layer, knowing that any one of those applications can get there. The last thing that was brought up was this whole question of the evolving technology, and are we kind of arrogant to say that we're done? TCP/IP is it. We don't need any more evolution there. I think that there's an argument to say that we are in some ways, and that TCP/IP is a layered architecture that allows a lot of innovation at the top and a lot of innovation below, and we all meet at this sort of narrow waist, and there's some real advantages to that. But if we're not, there's no reason why we can't create networks that interoperate with the traditional network, and we can create radically new networks that have great characteristics. But again, if you allow the person who controls the last mile to say, this is the network you will use, then that's not an open marketplace. And so I think that's the problem we face.
James, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, in hearing some of the back and forth, I'm always struck by some of these arguments because, in some say in some sense they're an argument over a fight that we're not having. There is a constant refrain, it seems, about the clear and present danger that network operators pose to applications, and yet on my way over from the train station, I checked my Facebook, I checked the internet, I checked a whole host of applications, and many of you are going to go home today and you're going to check all the applications that you know and love. And there's an assumption that is built into a lot of these discussions that there is an inherent conflict that I would argue is not true, and certainly we ought not to assume as being true, because all of us as broadband network operators have a very real business interest in promoting all of you as consumers to go out and to use the networks in any way that you want. That does not mean that we don't have challenges, that we don't have new types of applications that are not that don't play very well with other types of applications and cause issues related to congestion that we have to solve. But to argue that this is kind of a we versus they mentality, it just flies in the face of the facts as they exist today, and as we are building our networks to enable consumers to do what they want, where they want it, at any time that they want. And that's the fight we're not having.
Professor Wu?
Yeah, thanks. Professor Yu and Mr. Quinn have, and all of them actually, have presented a kind of an appealing face to the cable and companies and to AT&T, sort of these friendly companies that are interested in cooperating with application, but kind of trying to, sort of like a hippie commune, you kind of hang out and. But the reality, and from being inside the industry, is that industry is nothing like that. It's not a warm, friendly place where people cooperate and make friends. It's where companies try and destroy each other if they can make more money that way. And it's clear they can make more money that way by dominating the internet, deciding who succeeds and who fails. AT&T in particular has a very long track record. For the last 120 years, it has probably killed more companies than any other company in human history, maybe Standard Oil being the only competitor. AT&T is the equivalent of a convicted felon in business terms. It has again and again destroyed companies after company after company, merged, acquired, or simply extinguished. And so why would they do any different on the internet? This has been their business model, not since 1877, but since 1907. Acquire, destroy, and dominate. Now, they have very friendly people working and individually very nice, but that, a shark is a shark. It can act certain ways, but it has been designed, its DNA is about acquiring and destroying, and that is what it has been doing for the last 100 years. And if it gains control of the internet, what we should expect it to do again.
Robert Quinn, I'd give to you.
Where do I begin?
Should I lean away?
Yeah, you better.
Yeah.
You know, look, I don't even know how to address it, right? You want to talk about a 120-year history. All I will tell you is that in today's environment, we are trying to sell as much internet as we can sell. And as I think Professor Economides pointed out, the closed systems of the past did not succeed. AOL did not succeed with the walled garden approach that it wanted to have for the internet. And our companies have learned from the failures of other companies that openness is what people want. And I would tell you that we have embraced the 4 principles that are in place at the FCC today and the structure that's in place at the FCC today in order to be able to deliver that openness. We don't have any desire in blocking where people go on the internet or downloading the content that they want to download on the internet. That's not, we don't want to be the police officer of that. We want to provide broadband connectivity to the world to be able to connect our customers to where they want to go on the internet.
It sounds like Professor Wu, though, is arguing that without a law that we have to trust AT&T and Verizon.
But you don't have to. I would say that you don't have to trust us. We have a framework in place at the Commission that allows you to go to the arbiter when there are issues as to whether or not there's been something that's happened that's anti-competitive or anti-consumer in place. We have that framework at the Commission that Professor Wu used 2 years ago.
Professor Wu, do you want to respond?
And he knows about that.
I mean, I just think it's a little rich. AT&T has spent the last decade trying to defang the FCC to try and eliminate any oversight of the internet, and now you're saying we're very happy we have the FCC, in charge, looking over everything. You have done everything possible to try and make the FCC a nullity.
Well, I disagree with that. I absolutely disagree with that. I think that we've spent the last 10 years arguing that the laws around the voice services that were there were no longer necessary because, in case anybody hasn't noticed, the voice industry that existed 10 years ago simply does not exist today. And that's just pure fact. In terms of the amount of substitution that's occurring, not only from over-the-top voice applications on the broadband world, but the substitution that occurs in the wireless world as well.
Your teammate,
if I
Chris,
can,
was trying to...
What's interesting to me is, just as a sidelight, there's a deep irony that says, we've had this 100-year history, which we need to get, which we tried to get the government to stop before, and it's a bad history, so we'll have the government stop them this time, and this time it's really going to work. Set that to one side. We're in a very different world now. Verizon has openly said we are no longer defending the telephone business. There are now more wireless subscribers than there are wireline subscribers, and if you ask my students, 90% of them don't even have a wireline phone. We now have more wireless broadband subscribers than even cable modem or DSL subscribers, and we're in a different world. So yes, we had a world before that was based on dial-up, and it was designed for the military. So cost didn't matter, and efficiency didn't matter. It was not designed for those purposes. And Dave Clark, who was the protocol officer, said, and that was right for the military because they didn't care about cost. We're in a world now where we're no longer leveraging the infrastructure. What we're seeing is the next generation is not going to be the copper twisted pair and the coax. It's going to be FiOS. It's going to be big money for spectrum and new investments in new infrastructures. And what's going to happen is we can look at the prices in the 700 megahertz auction between the one that had an open access one and one that didn't, and you can actually derive the price. And you can actually look at the difference between $24 billion for FiOS to build 100 meg to the home versus AT&T UVerse, but the only way they can provide video is by prioritizing video and using a very aggressive management to do it through a 30 meg pipe. The difference? $18 billion. And if we have to do the $24 billion solution instead of the $6 billion solution everywhere we build out, we're going to get less broadband. There's going to be less competition, and it's going to be a much, much different world. And so with this, the challenges that are being faced here are very, very real.
Yeah, can I want to seize on this question of whether we really live in different times. Obviously we do. I mean, technologically we're in very different things, but some things never really change, and one of them is the problem of too much public power, tyranny. And the other is the problem of too much private power. We've had for 400 years in this country a system of common carriage which is designed to put some check on private power of businesses which are essential to the country, whether they're bridges, whether they're ferries, whether they're trains. We've had certain businesses that are just too important to the economy to be discriminatory. We've always had these. It's only the last several years, basically the last 10 years, that we've thought that somehow we can do without such rules. And so I'm suggesting that certain principles are timeless, that we do need to have some public oversight of extremely powerful private companies. I think you only have to look at the financial sector to understand this point. We have let deregulation go too far.
Well,
And with no oversight over private power, we will see consequences we won't like.
if I can jump in, rather than go down the tarring of industries by their association with the financial sector, I want to go back to what Tim was saying and say we're not entirely without checks here. We have the antitrust laws on the books to deal with anti-competitive practices. What we're talking about here is a new law, a law based on common carriage that just quite honestly doesn't fit the age. I mean, there were proceedings back way back when the FCC was trying to promote competition among models. If any of you are regulatory geeks, you may recall the video dial tone proceedings and the open video system proceedings. And those systems just simply didn't work to garner the types of investment that we needed to build modern networks. And ultimately, this question comes down to the choices that consumers make every day with respect to using their networks. And one of the things that I think as we consider new laws and whether or not that is a good thing or a bad thing is whether or not we're going to trust the consumers to get this right, or whether in a fast and dynamic and constantly changing space that the internet is today, that we want to delegate that responsibility to regulators who, quite honestly, don't have the track record that would give us confidence to trust them over the consumer.
Bob, let me
Professor,
jump in
actually,
here for a second.
could we bring in Professor Economides? He's actually written extensively on antitrust.
Well, before we go to antitrust, I want to just talk to the one point of that. Thank you.
Professor Economides yields to Brad Burnham.
Thank you. Whether or not we have, whether or not we need a law, and you're all saying that we have these procedures at the FCC. We can address on a case-by-case basis any of the problems that might come up with some kind of discriminatory action. Well, that doesn't help me as an investor in young, early-stage companies where I might be able or willing to put $5 or $6 million into a company, and we have companies now that are significant players on the internet stage, whether it's Twitter or Foursquare, who took very little capital up front, and if they were required to go to the FCC and argue a case to be allowed to continue to do the work they were doing, they wouldn't be in business. So we can't, without having a clear framework within which I can afford to make an investment in a young company, there's no way that a lot of the innovation that you see at the edge, at the application layer, is going to happen.
But Brad, you were able to make those investments.
What?
You were able to make those investments under the existing structure that's out there today.
We've already
have
discussed
to do that.
why we were able in the past to make those investments. It has to do with the fact that the web was a narrowband web where there was no last mile control, and there wasn't technology that allowed for deep packet inspection that allowed for a kind of discrimination.
But
those
Brad,
two things have changed.
That cuts both ways, though, because just as you're hesitant to invest in companies, there are carriers who are hesitant to deploy differentiated classes of services because they're worried about the overhanging liability of network neutrality, of a potential law. There are startup companies who need those end-to-end guaranteed quality of service guarantees to make their things deploy. And what's interesting to me is that the uncertainty that surrounds the space and the uncertainty that will surround a regulation is going to be really, really hard, because I guarantee, even under the best of times, it's going to take 6 months to change. That's not internet time.
Professor Economides.
Let me say something about this issue of antitrust and how this debate actually started, the net neutrality issue. First of all, I mean, the idea that we can deal with things with antitrust in the internet time is completely crazy. Microsoft trial took, the resolution of the trial took 7 years. Even now, as we speak, once a month, somebody from the Attorney General's office in New York flies to Redmond and fights again with Microsoft on the terms of the agreement. So the idea that we're going to allow antitrust law and suits that come later and so on to shape the industry, I think it's nuts. We might as well jump off the river next door here. I mean, it won't solve the problem at all. Second problem is that I understand that people came today and have an openness to various ideas. And I won't go back 100 years, but if we go back to 2005, Ed Whittaker, who was CEO of SBC, and he was a great CEO of SBC. He managed to make SBC, which was a small company, regional, Bell operating company in the South, in Texas, Arizona, and so on. He managed to make it AT&T. He acquired this company and that and that and that, and eventually, when AT&T was in bad shape, acquired AT&T, became AT&T. And when he was at the height of his power, after he had just acquired AT&T, and as he was about to acquire the last one, Bell South, he went to Business Week and said, oh, you know, we need to make Yahoo and Google pay because these guys use my network and they don't pay this far. And it's time that I start collecting money. So it might be very nice people and saying very nice things right now, but the company has other goals. I mean, you have to keep it in mind. We have net neutrality right now. All we're trying to do is make it law, make it appropriate. It's not the government coming in with an onerous regulation. All the government says is we're going to write non-discrimination. It's not such a big deal, right? We're not going to say the price is going to be this or the price is going to be that, because if you look at FCC regulations, they say all kinds of things for voice and so on. And this is just a couple of phrases. And for this is not okay? I can't believe it.
Nick is a good enough antitrust lawyer to know something, though, which is we talked about common carriage, and we've learned a lot, and we spent a lot of time studying this. Common carriage actually works when products are simple, like natural gas and water, where it doesn't have a lot of variety. When you try to do a non-discrimination regime in a very complex product, so to start off, you charge someone differently because the shipping costs different. Okay, we understand that. It's a real different cost. If there's a cost-based justification. Okay. Well, what happens if they're using different production technologies? How are we going to evaluate what is a truly justifiable cost or not? What if the product is complex and varies in terms of the services it provides and the way it does? And what we've learned over time is that it's very easy to say non-discrimination. But when you actually look at where these are on the ground implemented in legal regimes, you end up having these enormous fights over what is justifiable discrimination and what's not justifiable discrimination. And largely, the general assessment has been through a lot of the antitrust literature is that this is going to Trinco, this is essentially something that's beyond the capability of people to do. And so it's saying that non-discrimination is the solution. There is another solution. Right now, I don't think anyone would suggest we should do common carriage on wireless phones. Because right now we have 4 players who have national coverage and a wide variety of smaller players. And we're not saying we need to rate regulate them. In fact, we can get out of that business. And we're not worried about one of them dropping out of the network because if the way that market is structured is competitive enough, we actually have a different solution where we do not need the government managing the prices and we don't need the government managing the access because that's actually working very well. And that's a structural solution that is an alternative to regulating non-discrimination that is actually, I think, is a much more attractive.
Right, Burnham?
So I completely get the idea that if you think about a network as everything from the application all the way down through the physical connectivity, and you begin to think about what it means to manage that, it's very complex. But if you break it down horizontally, and all of us are now familiar with the notion that there's a sort of a physical connectivity layer, there's a logical connectivity layer, and there's an application layer on top of that. And that's a model that is essentially the basis of the web. And once you do that, and you begin to think about, okay, all of the problems, Chris, that you're talking about in terms of, being able to evolve the network and try out new services and stuff, a lot of that's going to happen above the physical layer. Now, and if we just enforce neutrality at that physical layer, that's where the common carriage is taking place. It's not taking place in the whole thing. I guess the thing that I'm confused about is that there is no reason that we can't invest in the physical plant of the network and have a net neutrality law. You can do that. What we're saying here is you don't want to do that. You want to be able to reach up into the applications layer, and you want to be able to provide high-margin enhanced services that will have an advantage over anybody else in the market because you control the physical layer as well, because that will give you the pricing power in the applications layer to get access to more margin. That will allow you to do more of a build-out. That may not be a good social choice. You can still build out just as a physical and invest in the physical layer.
James Assey.
I don't think that model works. I mean, that whether it's a cable company or a telco company, it seems pretty clear that a model that allows people to try all sorts of things rather than just the thing that your network provider provides you has won out. And all of us are trying to build networks that will accommodate that. But we make a huge mistake if we believe that only the edge has a monopoly on innovation. We need to build next generation networks that will support things that we haven't even thought of yet. In order to do that, we need to be able to innovate, to come up with new business models that will support that. And ultimately, if we err, if we go astray, there are the powers of the antitrust laws to protect us from anti-competitive activity. And notwithstanding what Nick said, I don't think even an FCC proceeding could act fast enough as quickly as things change on the internet. But more importantly, and most often what we see, it's the consumers who let people hear about it when things happen that they don't like.
If I may, the other thing that I would add to this is that I love the fact I can about to say some technically things that I usually can't say to most audiences because you'll understand. The layers between application and physical are not as neatly separated as Brad suggests. So for example, one of the classic problems is the network is done to allocate bandwidth it's called flow rate fairness, equally across TCP/IP flows. So what do applications do? They open up 10 flows. They open up more flows. And so what we've had now, because of the interaction at the lower levels, we've had to put in rules about limiting the number of flows an application can open up. Second, below the layer, we've had a debate through the 80s and the early 90s about active queue management. We used to do tail drop. We used to just do first in, first out routing, and we discovered that that was biased against bursty applications, and steady state applications were favored. It was biased against websites that had long round trip times, and so we've moved to a global active queue management network in the routers, in the core of the network, down below at the data link level, where we're now doing random early detection, which is a much more intelligent system. But guess what? We're discovering that even then, the only place that's got the information to allocate that fairly is in the network and the routers. So that's what we're talking about: weighted fair queuing, class-based queuing, all these extremely intelligent regimes within the core of the network that are needed to allocate bandwidth fairly so someone doesn't open up a billion sessions and just hog all the bandwidth or discriminate against bursty applications. Now, those are just two examples to me about how there are interactions above and below the IP layer that determine how the network performs and determines whether any part of the network can allocate bandwidth to different applications fairly.
The only problem is that there's nothing in what we're supporting that is against anything he's talking about. We're not in any way against innovation in networking. And I think the most important and powerful proof of this point is a company not represented here, Verizon, which is doing the most innovate in terms of what kind of networks they're deploying, and they're big supporters of net neutrality. They are the proof that you can be a supporter of net neutrality and also have the incentives to deploy. They've deployed much more. In fact, they're much more aggressive than AT&T, in my opinion. Yet they are backers of the net neutrality principles, as witnessed by the last filings. And so this sort of false dichotomy between being a supporter of common carriage or net neutrality and having network innovation is proven false by Verizon, which again supports net neutrality, spends the most on deployment.
Well, I'm going to tell you right now that we all, I think, support the four principles that are already in place at the FCC. I mean, I think I started my discussion today by telling you, I think we've got a regime that works today. And that's the regime that's in place today. And we've been very clear about that for a long time at AT&T. And we've also been clear that we believe that the FCC has the authority to make sure that companies obey those principles. You know, we are for openness. We're not out trying to dictate where people can go and cannot go on the internet. But if you have a strict non-discrimination standard, then none of the stuff that Chris talked about is going to be able to happen in the network with a strict non-discrimination standard, quite simply. Because you're not doing things on a first-in, first-out basis. Because you have to treat different applications differently. Because you have to manage between applications because they don't always play nice with one another in terms of the amount of bandwidth they want to consume. And in a strict non-discrimination world, I got to be dumb and blind to all of that. And I'm telling you, we can't build enough bandwidth to handle the applications that the people in this room are going to build over the next 20 years. We just can't do it. So we have to manage it. And I will tell you that there's no way that Verizon supports a non-discrimination principle. Not a non-discrimination principle that's going to prohibit them from doing that kind of management of their network.
I thought that we all agreed, or at least the FCC proposes, to allow management of the network. So the issue is never management of the network. The issue is the discrimination principle. And I'm encouraged that the representative of AT&T, Mr. Quinn, says that he's willing to accept some non-discrimination, but maybe not all. So that would be a starting point to see what types of non-discrimination is AT&T willing to accept. Because I can think of really horrible ones. And unless AT&T comes out and says, we're not going to do the really horrible ones, then we don't have common ground. If AT&T were to come out and say, and the cable companies, oh, here is the 15 horrible cases that we agree we're not going to do, then we will have a much better possibility of overall agreement. But I wonder, is this going to happen?
Jim, if you'd like to wrap this up, this will be the last one before we take questions from the audience.
No, well, I also am happy to hear Mr. Quinn's comments. And if AT&T in fact supports net neutrality, then I don't know why we're having this debate. You know, I mean, the debate's over. I mean, you know, they obviously agree that net neutrality laws are necessary. So if they're on our side, that's great. That's all I can say.
It's the two additional. It's the two. You understand there were 4 principles that were written in 2005, never enacted into law. It's the 2 new ones that are the fight. The 2 new ones that were proposed on October 22nd. That was non-discrimination and disclosure of information of the services. So when Mr. Quinn's saying he agrees to the 2005 ones, he's not agreeing to the ones that were proposed 3 weeks ago.
I'm not agreeing to a new regime that replaces the regime that we have today in place, right? What we have in place today are 4 principles that preserve openness, and that's what we have supported in the past. Okay. And we continue to support that.
And now I'd like to take some questions from the audience. Hold on, grab the mic.
Okay, so I love the internet like you guys do down there, and I feel like you guys just sort of like it. But I love it for all the reasons that Brad invests, which is that it's the open market, right? So I'm a lover of the internet and a free market capitalist. And what I'm trying hard to understand, because I voted for you in the beginning, was why can't there be free market principles at work on the ISP level? Is it because of the duopoly that you mentioned, Brad? Or what else is it?
The short answer is that it's the duopoly, and that there is a market failure in the fact that there is not a competitive local loop. If there were a competitive local loop and you had 5, 6, 7 different people that you could get your service to your house from, then there would be no issue here, because there would be a market correction that would favor openness.
But then the question becomes, if the problem is the duopoly, there's 2 ways we can look at this. We are stuck with the duopoly, so we have to regulate the problems out. The other hope is to try to get a third pipe to the home. The third pipe of the home, the realistic prospect, is wireless. If you look at the numbers, that's where the adoptions are. If you look at the way it's deploying in the third world, that's where the future is. And if you look, that's going to be what's going to be. Anyone who works in the wireless space says heavy discrimination and management is essential to make that a viable service. If you get too many video downloaders on one node, that's all the bandwidth you got. And so what they're saying is, and you can actually look at the price in the 700 megahertz auction, you can actually compare the per bandwidth, the per megahertz price for open access spectrum versus managed spectrum. And you can actually quantify exactly what it's going to be. And so I would agree with all this, but the solution I would is not ask what's going to preserve the access. The question is to do that indirectly by saying what's going to get that third pipe to the home. And if we can get that third pipe to the home, we should make it whatever. I think that's the right way to frame the question. And we may disagree on what the aspects are, but I think the evidence in the numbers is showing that, that managed systems have become essential.
If I can add something on this, I mean, there is a short-term problem and a long-term problem. There is nothing wrong with having more pipes. It's great if we ever have them. But in the short run, we have to have a solution. And the short-run solution is this particular regulation.
So, guys, aren't we conflating, you touched on this a little bit, aren't we conflating the antitrust issues with the common carriage issues? I wish you guys would talk a little bit more about common carriage, because to say that adding one more pipe to the home resolves the issue, it doesn't resolve the issue. We still have the problem with common carrier access to the internet. And whether or not you're a common carrier that offers access to 1 million customers or a common carrier that offers an old CLEC that offers carriage to a single customer, you are still a common carrier and you should still be subject to some, some obligations as a common carrier above and beyond anything that might apply in an antitrust context.
I think you're directing that over there, right?
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Right.
So I agree. I think there's always been since when you get in a taxi in New York, it's a common carrier. It picks up anyone, it takes you where you want to go, and it charges the same rates to everybody. And it's very important for the New York City economy to work, that everybody can just get into a taxi. If you got in a taxi and you work for Microsoft or something, you couldn't get in a taxi, and if you work for GM, you could. Or the city would. The commerce would grind to a halt if you had discrimination in taxis. And there's always been certain instrumentalities essential to the economy that are kept as common carriers. It's extremely important. It's been in English common law since the 15th century. And I don't think that has fundamentally changed. It used to be ferries and ports. Now it's the internet. I just don't think that's changed.
But if you look at, what I would say is that I actually think the New York taxi example makes the other point, which is it also limits entry. It puts a heavily regulated environment to the point where if you want to buy a taxi cab, you need to pay $250,000, $300,000 in upfront cost to get the medallion. That's the other side of common carriage. You have to get all the regulation in terms of the inspections and all these other things, and it becomes a huge problem. And I'm not convinced, if you look at the history of common carriage regulation, we've learned a lot over 100 years. If you want to think of an example, go back to the 80s when the big problem was IBM and AT&T, which tells us ourselves how much the space changes rapidly. If we're talking about the general common carriage thing we might have worried about, it was the 386 IBM PC. That was the flexible platform that we needed for everyone. But no one would regulate that. Why? Because it was growing and changing and dynamic. And what we discovered over time is the only things that we can really regulate with common carriage are things that are static, simple, and easy to count up. Because what's happened is, if you think about this, when we did common carriage regulation under the computer inquiries in the 80s and 90s, they had protocol conversion. They digitized. They needed exceptions. They had vertical switching services, caller ID. They needed to get exceptions. And we had a delay of caller ID and vertical and call forwarding and all those services. And actually, someone's counted them up. Jerry Hausman at MIT said the consumer welfare loss from the delay, we ran into multiple billions.
I got to jump in here. Did I just hear a comparison between the IBM PC architecture and the last mile?
The point I'm making is that you're talking about flexible, you're talking about general purpose things that everyone
Right, well, let's think about the IBM PC architecture. It was not by IBM's choice. It was an accident there, too, but it was an open architecture. Dell was in the market almost instantly, and there were, 1,000 vendors of that exact identical architecture. That was an incredibly competitive market. There was also an open layered API that defined where the software was layered on top of that architecture, and that was an open architecture. It's just ridiculous to make that comparison.
But we have a closed architecture, which is Apple, which persists in a competitive environment. In fact, IBM's essentially gone as a PC manufacturer, and Apple persists. And what we have is, if you look, the other analogy I give you, a good one, is if you look in the wireless world, if we standardize protocols in the wireless world between TDMA and CDMA at the time that came up, we would not have the EVDO and the bridge technologies to the modern internet today.
Okay, I'm going to have to break this up to go to a new question.
Sorry.
So I'm just curious if you guys are opposed to a world where we're, this is to the folks who are pro net neutrality, are we opposed to a world where we are paying for premium bandwidth, we're paying for premium packets where the margins are controlled, where AT&T doesn't have the ability to undercut my business because they own the pipe? Because I mean, as far as I know, I'm already paying a premium for bandwidth. I'm at least paying more than I could for cheap, low quality bandwidth, and I understand that my service is affected by the fact that we're not paying for data centers in Europe right now, for example. So I'm just curious. I'm not especially, as somebody who builds these applications, I'm especially opposed to the idea of, while I'm working on my tool in my garage or, out of my bedroom, for it to have slower access than Amazon, who's able to pay a huge premium for not only that data pipe, but, also for the expedited shipping that they have, that they are able to afford, and makes their business better than the competition's.
Yeah, if I can take it on. Net neutrality has never been opposed to the idea of pay more, get more. Obviously a person who's starting a business or a blog doesn't need huge amounts of bandwidth, at first at least. And there's just nothing, it's just not the issue. We've always said that what we're opposed to is you needing to pay to reach AT&T's customers. Like an extra fee to reach. So you want, AT&T has, 60 million customers. Would you like to reach them? How about $1 each? The 60 million, that's not a huge amount of money for a big business. That's what we're opposed to.
But it actually
Can we bring in Robert Quinn here?
I'm sorry.
Well, that's all right. This is, let me give you a different way to look at it, a different idea that may exist in the future, right? And that is, the internet is a best efforts queue, right? And one of the possibilities that exists in the future is more and more entertainment is going to move over to the internet. And we know, based on our experience, we know that people want quality when that happens, and they're going to want managed services, or they're going to want some kind of management that's going to guarantee the quality. Now, you could go out and build servers around the country so that you don't need to buy QoS from a provider in order to provide that quality. I'm not going to make you buy the service, but if you want to have that available, that you can buy off the shelf from the infrastructure provider, so that you can reach your customers with a managed product, and they're buying a service from you, isn't that a good thing as opposed to a bad thing? You don't need to build the server farms that Google has in order to be able to compete with Google. And we come from a DNA that sells, if we can offer these kinds of services, we're going to have the incentive to sell as much of them as we can. And rather than, net neutrality, therefore, is prohibiting me from selling those services or creating those services, net neutrality, rather than protecting the developer in the garage, is actually going to hurt them in the long run. Because you're going to have to replicate the infrastructure of your competitors who are way ahead of you in the market in order to be able to compete with them. And so this is, I'm not going to sit here and defend the last 100 years, and Tim can go talk about that, we'll do that over drinks. But I'm just telling you, the cost to build this infrastructure is enormous. And we want to sell as much service as we can, but at the same time, we want to keep the cost to the consumer as low as possible so that we can get everyone connected. We're in an ecosystem, and we need to cooperate with one another.
Can we hear from the side for the motion why a fast lane is necessarily a bad idea?
Let me say something for what Bob just said. Bob's story makes sense, but it's upside down. If really there was a demand by Disney or by Google or by anybody else to ask for prioritization of their bits. They would have asked. They would be begging AT&T and the cable company saying, please, the consumers complain. Give us faster bandwidth. Give us a special lane. Well, do you hear this guy saying that? No. Instead of we hear AT&T saying, oh, we want to create the services. Yeah, it's important, but nobody really wants them. I mean, come on. I mean, is this a real business model?
In answer to the question,
I think we're going to move on from this and take. I just want to get to a number of questions from the audience. Hank Williams.
I'm curious about. Really, I guess this question is for the pro-net neutrality side. It seems like this debate is a little bit more complicated than I'm hearing, because on the wireless side, it seems clear there's not enough bandwidth, and if you were to impose net neutrality principles in the sort of wireless realm, there would be problems. On the other hand, on the landline side, it seems like I really can't imagine a scenario where we really need net neutrality. So I'm sort of curious, I guess, if there's any room for sort of nuance in this debate as it relates to wireless versus landline.
James Assey, would you like to respond to that?
Well, I mean, I think you hit a point that I'm sitting here thinking about the argument we're not having, but point out, which is, we often bandy these terms about non-discrimination in terms of black and white, and in truth, they're always related in shades of gray. We're for a principle of non-discrimination, but oh no, we didn't mean to preclude you from doing that, or from doing that, or from doing Y. And this is kind of the type of, constant regulatory involvement that new rules and whether they're applied to wireline or wireless is going to necessarily involve a regulator in making technical decisions that are best left to companies who are struggling every day to try and meet the needs of their consumers. In the end, it's the consumer that's going to choose whether or not the applications that they're getting are meeting their needs, or else they're going to do something else. And I think you point out a very relevant point, which is we often like to think of this as being simple, but it's really hard. I mean, it's very difficult. And if we think about passing laws, we'd best be thinking about the law of unintended consequences, because we have seen that in the past.
Professor Wu?
Yeah, I'll talk about the wireless. I actually disagree with you just a little bit, in the sense that I think that there is, and I think as I talk through this you'll realize it, that there is some importance to the core net neutrality principles in the wireless world as well. There are now, since the wireless market's been opening up, there are also application developers, people trying to innovate and reach consumers. And it is important that the wireless browser be an open browser, be an interface where people can reach their customers for application. For those of you who may be in this audience who are trying to develop wireless apps, it's equally as important to be able to reach your customers as it was in the internet. If we want to replicate success of the internet in the wireless market, we're going to need some openness. We're going to need an environment where small developers, small entrepreneurs can take a shot at reaching customers. So I think it's actually important in wireless as well to have some basic guidelines, no blocking, no degrading, to make that market take off.
And it comes back to this question that, where we are agreeing, and we don't seem to be able to convince these guys that we are agreeing that that if the problem is congestion and you're managing that congestion in a non-discriminatory way, it's the application provider's problem to figure out how to get around that, and there's no issue with getting access to their end customers. But if the way that you're going to get around the congestion problem is to look inside the packets, figure out which application providers are doing what, and then make the determination yourself which ones need to be handled, then I think we've opened up a can of worms that I don't know how we manage.
But I think the problem is more complex, you're right. Most people know, most wireless devices don't have an IP address. They don't have end-to-end visibility. They only run 2 layers of the stack, and they usually attach the internet through a gateway out present in the network, so it can't function in the same way. Second, the congestion inference we've had since the 80s is that a dropped packet was from congestion, not from link failure. That is not a good assumption with a wireless device as you go through different cells. And so, in fact, what we're seeing is new technologies experimenting with new forms of congestion management to deal with wireless by putting a congestion detection device in the middle of the web, some of which deviate from the IP semantics, some of which don't.
Robert,
now, I don't know which technology is going to work best, but I don't know that we should have a regulator worrying, a person worrying, am I going to be discriminatory if I deviate from the IP semantics?
Robert, could you address Brad's point, though, about the danger of inspecting packets and prioritizing and giving that ability to AT&T?
Well, we have that ability today. I mean, we have to be able to manage the network, and we have to be able to manage the traffic that's coming across our network. You know, I think that the network architecture is going to evolve over time, but that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing applications that are demanding more bandwidth. They're not playing nice with other applications. I think I said that before. And you have to be able to manage the network, and you have to be able to recognize that some applications have time sensitivity built into them and others don't. And the network providers got to be able to handle that. The way the network is architected, adding more bandwidth isn't always the answer. And a lot of times it's not the answer because a drop packet doesn't necessarily indicate congestion, which is what the TCP/IP protocol tells it. So that absolutely has to remain in the realm of the network operator to be able to do that. And if we have to go to the FCC to be able to determine, can we prioritize this packet versus that packet, we're not going to be able to operate the network. And I'm telling you right now, we can't build enough bandwidth to solve the problem. And even if we could, it still won't solve the problem given the way the protocol works.
Okay, I'm going to have to actually end the round there, and I thank the audience for their questions. We now move on to round 4, where the debaters will make their closing arguments to the audience, arguing against the motion, a network neutrality law is necessary. I'm sorry, I guess it would be James Assey. Yes, James Assey, arguing against the motion. He is the Executive Vice President for the National Cable and Telecommunications Association. James Assey.
Thank you. And thank you. This has been a lot of fun. Root canal next week. No. No, it is fun. And, you know, we need to have more of these discussions because I am a firm believer that though we fight about these issues, we are part of an ecosystem. There's a symbiotic relationship between network and edge, and it's in both of our interests to discuss these issues, to talk about the challenges we face, and to try and solve them. And I would argue solve them outside of the realm of a government regulator space. We are on a journey as a nation, as Bob said, to expand the reach and capability of our networks. So far over the last 10 years, as I said, we've done it fairly successfully. We've gone from 1% broadband penetration to somewhere north of 60%. But we have further to go, and it's going to cost a lot of money able to do it. As we think about a new law, one of the things I would stress again is that ultimately a lot of these concerns are hypothetical. They're based on anecdote, and when occurrences have occurred over the last 10 years in this space, they've been quickly corrected. We like to see things in black and white, but the fact of the matter is they're gray, and if we turn this over to trying to decide these issues based on new rules that are based on ambiguous terms in a very dynamic market, in a circumstance that is simply going to invite conflict rather than resolution, we do ourselves and our consumers a disservice. There is a better way to go. It's the way and the path that we're currently on now, in which we're able to promote innovation and the growth of the internet as it exists today. Thank you.
Next, arguing for the motion, a network neutrality law is necessary, Professor of Law at Columbia University, Tim Wu.
Yeah, thanks. Well, this has been great. I enjoy a chance to talk about
taxis and ferries and whatever else happened in the last 100 years. I want to close by reiterating that there's been an effort, I think, on the other side to sort of bring up fears of government over-regulation, too much involvement, regulators trying to decide how the internet works. What we're talking about is a very simple law that is designed to prevent abuse. We're not talking about, a bunch of FCC staffers getting involved in complex determinations of how to run AT&T's network. We're talking about a basic rule which preserves the structure of the internet, preserves a model which has been extremely successful for the last 20 to 30 years. And so I think it's very important to understand how much government oversight has been rolled back. I mean, there's been an effort to sort of suggest that this is a new regime, everything. The internet was born under very careful scrutiny of AT&T. The only reason the internet took off was because AT&T was prevented from interfering with it in the 1980s. And what we are talking about is really a return to the conditions where we have successfully protected entrepreneurs and innovators who are very vulnerable from domination, natural domination by the largest carriers. I have nothing against cable or phone companies. I don't have cable subscription, but I do use a telephone. And it's just that they will do what's in their interest, which is to try to make money, and the easiest way to make money is to control the network and pick winners and pick losers and make deals that benefit them at the expense of the public. It's just natural behavior. I said earlier, the shark will eat other fish. Why not? That's what it does. And that's why there always has to be some level of public oversight. We have rolled back almost all of it. We're asking for really what is just a minimum, really just a minimum, to make sure the most serious abuses do not occur. So please vote yes for this resolution.
Next, arguing against the motion, a network neutrality law is necessary. Robert Quinn is the Senior Vice President, Federal Regulatory, AT&T. Robert Quinn.
Thank you. The beauty of the internet, there's a lot of beauties to it, but one of the things that I think makes the internet work so well is it's a marketplace where commercial and social interests interact with consumers, and we basically develop a communications infrastructure and a way for people to communicate with one another, to buy things, to buy apps. And it's an ecosystem in which we are all partners at the end of the day. We are partners with the application providers. We are partners with our consumers who buy the services. We are partners with the businesses who want to interact with the consumers in order to make money, because that, at the end of the day, is what capitalism is all about. The one fact, I think, and I would say that there are many facts that we agree on in this debate, but the one fact that I will tell you is indisputable is that the bandwidth and the infrastructure that we have today in place is not going to be sufficient 5 years from now or 10 years from now. And we are going to have to invest enormous amounts of money in order to build that infrastructure to keep up with the evolving demands of the applications that folks in this room are going to be creating over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. We all have an interest in making sure that we don't price broadband access in a way that makes it something that consumers don't want. We have an interest in making sure that we can have that service in the marketplace so that we can continue to thrive and grow the ecosystem that's in there today. And unfortunately, the rules that are being proposed by the other side, I think, are going to inhibit that, or they're going to restrict people's ability to be able to manage the applications and make them all work together over the course of the next 20 years. I think that they will deprive commercial opportunities from developing that will help defray the expense of that internet. And I do all this, and I say all this, with the knowledge that what we have in place are 4 internet principles, and the experience and history has told us that those principles will maintain openness, and we're going to all continue to maintain openness on the internet infrastructure. Sorry.
Next, arguing for the motion, Brad Burnham is a venture capitalist at Union Square Ventures. Brad Burnham.
So I'll come back to my initial point, which is that we've had a wonderful opportunity to invest in an incredible profusion of applications over the last 15 years, directly as a result of the fact that there was no control over how those applications were released. I understand the points that Bob is making. I agree that we are going to need more bandwidth. I understand the desire to manage the network. I do think it's possible to build more bandwidth and to manage the network in a non-discriminatory way. In fact, I think it may even be cheaper to build out more IP infrastructure than it would be to build more sophisticated management tools. If you think of the commoditization of the huge routers today and the number of people that are familiar with their use, it's probably a lot cheaper to do that than to create a new technology that would allow for the discrimination. Imagine how outraged you would be if a phone company were to listen in to your voice telephone calls and then to price those calls retroactively based on their decision about how important each one of those calls was. You would go through the roof, right? That's really what we're asking for. Well, that's really what our opponents here are asking for. They're asking for the ability to do that kind of discrimination. They say they don't want to do it, but I think they really can't have it both ways. If they don't need the ability to discriminate, then they shouldn't be opposed to a net neutrality law.
Arguing against the motion, Professor of Law at University of Pennsylvania, Christopher Yu.
To take the last thing that Brad said, none of this discussion has been about actually listening into content. It's been about tiered pricing, and it's about doing those sorts of services. There is a different debate. We haven't had it here tonight about this. Now, the question came about tiered pricing. Tim says no one favoring network neutrality opposes that. Until 2006, that wasn't true. Larry Lessig said in his testimony, for the first time, we can do tiered pricing for end users. You just can't do it on the access side. And now, since then, he's now retreated from that and said, you can do tiered pricing on the access side because we need those services, you just have to do it in a non-discriminatory way. This should give you a sense. This has been a moving target. And bear in mind that when Time Warner tried to do end-user consumer tiering, bandwidth tiers, public knowledge and free press jumped all over them about a year and change ago, and they made them back down saying that's a network neutrality violation. This is the question of overhanging liability. So if I were to give you 2 examples to motivate what might happen. People are doing new peering relationships all the time. They're talking about cloud peering, they're talking about secondary peering, which means that the people you have peering relationships are going to get service that's going to be faster and cheaper than other people's. Is that discriminatory? Even though 2 similarly situated content providers are not going to get the same service in terms of price or speed because you have a deal with one of them or your network provider does. Second, UVerse is $18 billion cheaper than Fios. They need the triple play to sell it. The way they do it is by prioritizing one application, video, from one source, AT&T, to make that work. If you can't let them do that, they're going to have to put $18 billion more on the table. So the question becomes, maybe Brad's right. Maybe this management stuff is going to be more expensive, and maybe we should just be building bigger pipes. Bracket the fact that in wireless we can't. Who should be making that decision? Should it be made by industry people, or should it be made by a government rule that is then subject to change? I think the rule we have is a world in which people can try different things, and we'll find out in the marketplace which is going to be the case without a regulatory thumb on one side of the scale.
Thank you. And finally, summarizing his argument for the motion, a network neutrality law is necessary, Professor Nicholas Economides from the Professor of Economics at the Stern School of Business.
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for coming here rather than going to dinner on what some people call an arcane subject, but I think you have already shown by being here that it's not arcane at all, and you care about the future of the internet. So let me remind you what will go wrong if the net neutrality proposal is killed. Innovation at the edge of the network will be significantly reduced. Consumers' benefit from the internet will be reduced. The telcos and the cable companies are going to choose the winner on the other side of the network in search, in this and that and that. There will be a chokehold on innovation. There will be a gatekeeper on the internet, something that I'm sure that all of you involved in internet applications don't want to do, don't want to be there. If there is a fast service created, it will to be sold at a higher price, then the remaining bandwidth is going to be squeezed further, so other people who don't pay the extra money will be also hurt. Innovators with small capitalization will lose in this game. They will not be able to be the one who is willing to pay whatever the gatekeeper wants. And this can have long-term consequences. Let me give you an example. Suppose that AT&T comes and says, from tomorrow on, whoever pays me in search is going to go in the fast lane, and whoever does not pay me is going to go in the slow lane. Something that is perfectly normal price discrimination, okay? And something that AT&T has not disavowed. What would happen? Google would pay, Google would win today. If the same thing was offered in 2001, who would have won? Yahoo would have won. And because of lock-in and network effects, Google wouldn't exist. Now, this is a realistic situation. If we allow this discrimination, it can really halt growth. And I picked up Google, but it could be anybody else in this setup. Additionally, telcos are going to favor their own services. Voice over IP will be treated preferentially. Cable companies already treat preferentially their own voice over IP over the voice over IP of independent guys like Vonage. Cable can slow down independent video. After all, it competes directly with their own service. So all these things that I say might sound like horror stories. And I really wish that the other side, at some point in time today, would have said, we're not going to do all this stuff. We commit not to do the most horrible type of price discrimination. But unfortunately, they haven't. So we have to really bring them up because these things can actually happen. And let me close down by one thing.
Your time
Am
is
I
up.
done?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for coming here.
And that concludes our debate. The last thing left is for the audience to now vote. And I apologize to those that have joined us via webcast because you didn't vote initially. We can't have you vote now, so we're going to turn the camera away for a moment. We will be back in a second. Okay. If you want to put the screen up again for the voting instructions. The motion, a network neutrality law, is necessary. If you are for the motion, text 99503 in the body for.
Brad. Nice try, Brad.
If you're against the motion, text against, and if you're undecided, text undecided. Raise your hand if you need more time. Okay, you can tally the results. You can come back. They're tallying them right now.
Brad, they vote off, but only if you're voting for him.
While we wait, I would like to thank some people that made tonight's event possible. Charlie O'Donnell, EIR at First Round Capital, Nate Westheimer, co-founder of AnyClip, Adam Schwartz, co-founder of S4, Joy Marino of JMPR, and Havesi of Newark City, and a special thanks to Marvin Amori of the Free Press, who has been instrumental in helping me guide me through the landscape of this process. His dedication to being both fair and even-keeled on this has been a great help in putting this on. So thank you to all those people and to him especially. Marvin actually is not here. He cannot be here.
Like the 2000 election.
Hanging chats. Teaching a technology class with the engineer, co-taught with engineering. One of the first subjects we're talking about is
The show of hands to be more efficient.
electronic voting system.
Before and after, that may have
The
been
show
that.
of hands
Sure.
would be much more efficient.
Not so
Sometimes-
low tech, Nick.
I know, efficiency, right?
Sometimes technology isn't the best answer.
You don't understand. You don't understand. It's not about efficiency. It's about.
And we have our
stuff.
results. So in round one, for the motion, 56% of the audience. Against the motion, 12%. Oh. Undecided, 32%. After the round, 80% of the motion, 80% of the audience was for the motion, 14%, 6 undecided. The side for the motion has moved the most votes. They're the winners of the debate. Congratulations.
Very well. Well done. Yeah, hell yeah.